Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the 18th dynasty of Egypt in our continuing study of the history of civilization. Egyptian history, as we've already said, we started with the Archaic period. That's the beginning of the dynastic eras, and then we have the Old Kingdom, the time of the pyramids, but everything fell apart after that, followed by the Intermediate period, and then the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptians looked at as their glory days. That was Dynasty 11 and 12. That's the era of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and that's when the Israelites come into Egypt. But then again, Egypt falls apart, and we're going to have the second intermediate period where again Egypt is no longer unified, but then that's followed now by the New Kingdom. And in the New Kingdom, this is going to be especially the 18th dynasty of Egypt, and it will be during that dynasty, I believe, that we read in the Bible of the Exodus. So we have the second intermediate period. The dates that I'm giving, even though I'm giving you exact dates, they're not really exact. It depends where you take the dating methods. But we're saying 1786 to 1567. That's the intermediate period. And we have this group that's come in. Did they invade? Did they migrate in? The Egyptians refer to them as the Heka Kazawet. That is the chieftains of a foreign hill country. They're also known to us as the Hyksos. The rulers of countries, Josephus described them as the shepherd kings. Not sure that he was right, not sure they were really shepherds, but they are Semitic. And they have Semitic names, and they have some Semitic words in what little writings we have of them. And they come in and they're ruling at least northern Egypt. Remember, we call that Lower Egypt. And they've brought with them, the Hyksos have brought with them the chariot, the six-spoked chariot wheel, and that lends to a very quick and very intensive attack, and that's going to change the face of warfare. Now, as the 18th dynasty arises, their claim to fame, and they're coming from Thebes, and their claim to fame is that they're going to push out the Hyksos. And so they adopt the weapons, maybe even the strategy as well, of their enemies. But we're going to see now the 18th dynasty taking these light chariots, and they're going to be using them in warfare themselves. The other interesting thing we're going to see about the 18th dynasty is, remember how we had the Old Kingdom, they were building pyramids. They sort of got away from that in the Middle Kingdom, but now they're not going to go back to pyramids. Instead, they're going to have their burials near Thebes, but on the west side of the Nile River, in the Valley of the Kings. And that's going to be one of the things that we see from the beginning with the 18th dynasty and continuing into the New Kingdom. We'll see burials in the Valley of the Kings. That valley, it's sort of isolated. Remember, you didn't go all the cities, the temples. They're on the east side of the river. On the west side of the river, you're going to have funeral temples. You're going to have the Valley of the Kings. Later on, there'll be a Valley of the Queens as well. So I'd like to take you just a moment on a trip. We're going to get into a hot air balloon, and we're going to take a ride up over the Valley of the Kings. And we're going to, of course, when you're in a hot air balloon, you go wherever the wind takes you, across the Nile, and looking down, of course, the Valley of the Kings is just behind us, but what you see in the foreground is the mortuary temple of one of the least known, at least up until fairly recently, pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, and that was Pharaoh Hatshepsut. Pharaoh Hatshepsut was not a man, was a woman who ruled Egypt. Now, how did that come to be? We start the 18th dynasty with Kamosis, and I want you to notice the names. Kamosis, Amenhotep, and since there's going to be a few of them, we call him the first. Then Thutmoses, and notice that segment Moses Ahmoses and then Thutmoses. There's also a Kamoses that's not really part of this dynasty. He's the brother of Ahmoses. But that Moses part is familiar to us from the Bible. The term Moses means to draw out or to give birth to, because when, after all, a child who's when a woman gives birth, that child is drawn out of her. And so drawn out of would be Ahmoses, or drawn out of Thut. That's one of the Egyptian gods. That's Thutmoses. And so we have a number of kings, and then Thutmoses the first, he and his wife, his royal wife, because they would always have, or often, but probably always have a number of wives. He gives birth to a daughter, Hatshepsut, and she's going to be significant to our story, because she marries, and in ancient Egypt, at least Egypt during this time, the way you were the pharaoh, yes, you had to be of royal blood, but really the thing was being married to the right gal. And so Thutmose the first, he doesn't have a son that can take over, and so Thutmose the second marries his Hatshepsut, and that gives him the right to become the new pharaoh, and he is, but he's a bit older, and they have 2 daughters, and then he dies. Now that's okay, because he has a son through a secondary wife, Iset, and that son is Thutmose the third, and Thutmose the third is eventually going to be pharaoh, but right now he's too young, and Thutmose the second has died, and so Hatshepsut rules for her son Thutmose the third, and so she's now ruling Egypt. But after a while, she takes not just the title of great wife. That's, they didn't have the word queen. The queen was the great wife, but she's actually going to take the title of pharaoh. And notice the picture. She's going to don the ceremonial beard, which represented the authority. It was one of the representations of authority of the pharaoh. She's going to take for her title the pharaoh of Egypt. That is, she's going to be king, not queen. Didn't have a word for queen. She's not just a great wife anymore. Now she's going to be the pharaoh of Egypt. And she's not pretending. She's not pretending she's a man. Everybody knows she's a woman. But Hatshepsut, and notice how she's pictured here. She's wearing the royal headdress. Everybody knows this is a woman. It's not a place, and yet she's ruling Egypt. We have her mortuary temple. I showed you an aerial view before. This is a sort of a bit more close up. It's one of the most beautiful temples that we have. It's set just out. It's not in the Valley of the Queens. It's set just outside the Valley of the Kings. And yet, until fairly recent times, we didn't know anything about this woman, this pharaoh Hatshepsut. You see, when Thutmose III finally does come to the throne, and he's old enough after a while, but his mother is still ruling as pharaoh. When he comes to the throne, he's going to change everything. In fact, he's going to rewrite history. Thutmose III comes along, and he's going to be like the Napoleon of Egypt. We've found his mummy. He wasn't very tall. He was a little bit short. And I don't want to say like Napoleon, because actually people think Napoleon was short, but he wasn't. Napoleon was 6 foot or so. But Thutmose III, he was a short little fellow, and yet he's going to be the greatest military conqueror that Egypt ever has or ever will see. In the space of 18 years, Thutmose III is going to make 17 different campaigns up through Canaan, through the Levant, marching all the way to the Euphrates River. He will beat the kingdom of Mitanni. We'll talk about that kingdom in a future lecture, into submission. He will not lose any battles. He will claim all. Now, he's not going to make colonies, Egyptian colonies. Egyptians didn't go in for that sort of thing. Egyptians like to stay in Egypt. Oh, they'll go out and raid and take everything that's not nailed down, but at the end of the day, they want to come back to Egypt, Thutmose III included. But one thing he will do, he will go through and erase every mention of his mother. That is his stepmother, Hatshepsut. There will be no mention of Hatshepsut as Pharaoh. Notice the two obelisks. The obelisk on the left is the obelisk of Hatshepsut, and he builds a wall around the obelisk. Now, part of that's fallen down, so you can see it now. But originally, this wall goes all the way up to the level of the top of the obelisk, and so he doesn't pull down the obelisk. That would be just too destructive. Instead, he builds a wall around it to hide it, to pretend, let's not talk about her at all. Places where it has her name, they'll either carve it out or they will plaster over it. Now, the good news is some of that plaster fell off, so now we know about her. But he's going to say, let's not talk about a time when Egypt was ruled by women. Now his son, Amenhotep II, comes to the throne. And Amenhotep II, and remember the dates are approximate, so around 1450 BC, Amenhotep II, unlike his father, he's a big tall guy. His father was short, and he says, you haven't seen anything like that. I'm going like me. I'm going to be just like Dad. I'm going to go and be a great military conqueror. And sure enough, he takes a fleet of ships, and they sail down the Nile to Nubia, and he conquers the various Nubian kings and princes and so on. And he takes these 7 Nubian kings. One of them he actually crucifies and nails to the front of his worship, and he comes sailing back down the Nile, saying, look at what I did to these Nubian princes. Has 6 of them sort of stapled to the walls of his of Thebes, and then like I said, the one is on the prow of his worship, and he conducts a raid into Canaan, and so far he's victorious. And then after the 9th year of his reign, he suddenly stops all military endeavors, and he never again sets foot out of Egypt. And he's going to reign quite a bit longer, but no more military. What happened? I think it's during this time that the biblical story of the plagues on Egypt takes place. Exodus chapter 13, verse 18. After the plagues take place, we read about how God led the people around the way of the wilderness up to the Red Sea. Now, that term Red Sea, scholars have made a lot of noise about the fact that the Hebrew there, the Yam Suf, refers to the Sea of Reeds, and that's true. But that's what they called the Red Sea. It's not a different place. So the Bible says about how God led the Israelites, the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, that the sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt. And so the Israelites, they left Egypt. Like I said, they went through the up next to the Yam Suf, and because it refers to the Sea of Reeds, there's some folk that have thought, well, the Israelites didn't cross the Red Sea; they just crossed that little tiny lake, that had some marsh reeds in it. That was just the Sea of Reeds. That's not true. We specifically read. We specifically read in Exodus chapter 14, verse 3, for the Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they're wandering aimlessly in the land. So the Israelites are actually told, go out, leave Egypt, but then turn around and come back to settle there, to camp there by the Reed Sea. Now, the Reed Sea is what they call the Red Sea. We know that because later on we're going to read in the Bible about Solomon building a fleet of ships on the Yam Suf, on the Reed Sea. At Eilat, which we call the Gulf of Aqaba. That whole body of water to the south, they call that the Reed Sea. And yet they're to turn around and come by the Reed Sea and camp there so that it looks like they're lost. They're going in circles. And that's going to entice the Pharaoh to come after them and to recapture them. And that's exactly what happens. And so we read in Exodus 14:7, that the Pharaoh took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over them. And they used the greatest weapon that was known in that world to come up against the Israelites. And God brings it to naught as he divides the waters of the Reed Sea, and the Israelites pass through. Now, it's not this little tiny narrow passageway that they pass through, but we read in the Bible, he uses the wind to part the waters, and the Israelites pass over en masse. And then the Pharaoh his armies try to go through to capture them, and they are drowned as the waters come back together. Exodus 14:21, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind. It was the wind that divided the sea, that turned the sea into dry land. And so the Israelites, according to the biblical story, they cross through and they escape Egypt. Now, after this, the next king that we read, and the Bible never says that Amenhotep II, and it doesn't give his name, it just calls him the Pharaoh. So if you've seen one Pharaoh, you've sort of seen them all. But it never says that the Pharaoh drowned in the waters of the Reed Sea, of the sea. But when he comes to the throne, Thutmose IV comes to the throne, and the first thing that Thutmose IV does, he has a obelisk placed between the paws of the Sphinx. You can still see, the original is now in the museum in London. You can still see a copy of that obelisk. It's there. And the obelisk tells a story about how when Thutmose IV was a very young fellow, that he had a vision where a prophet came to him. Maybe some people wonder, did the Sphinx sort of speak to him in this vision? Well, whatever. He has this vision that a message comes, a prophecy comes to him, that he will reign, that he will become the Pharaoh in place of his older brother. Well, wait a minute. The oldest always becomes the Pharaoh. So what's he doing coming to the throne? Why does he become Pharaoh? And again, I think the answer, remember, you have Thutmose III, who had given birth to Amenhotep II, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and then Amenhotep II had a number of sons. One of them would have been the oldest, but that older brother, according to the Bible, would have died in the plague of the firstborn. So instead now, Thutmose IV comes to the throne, and now he's going to rule as the next Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, after his rule, he'll have a son, Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III, if you want to see two statues of him, people refer to them as the Colossi of Memnon. That's what some Greeks called it, and that title stuck. But they were tourists, and they didn't really know what they were talking about. These two great statues, and they're right near where was the mortuary temple of Amenhotep. Unfortunately, it was built down sort of low in an area that used to flood. And so the temple has sunk into the ground, and it's been virtually destroyed. They were doing some digging there when I was there, but it was all sort of underground, and they were just looking for little bits and pieces. But these two these two statues remained, and they're in a very poor state of repair. Notice they're just sort of falling apart. There's been earthquakes that have damaged them, and there was a time after one particular earthquake where the wind would come through, and perhaps some dew that would be on the statue. When the sun first came up, the dew would sort of be evaporating, and the statue would whistle, maybe by the wind, maybe by the melting dew, and they would talk about the singing statue of Memnon. But this is Amenhotep III. And Amenhotep III, we've actually found letters dating to his reign. They were found in Amarna. He wasn't there, but the letters were taken there after he had written them. And both letters that he wrote, but also letters that other people from other countries wrote at the Amarna tablets. And these are written in Aramaic. They're written, not in Aramaic, I'm sorry, Akkadian cuneiform. But so they're not hieroglyphs. Because hieroglyphs are just read in Egypt. They're not read by other people. And so these are letters of information that are going to and from Egypt from outside countries. And these Amarna tablets tell the story. There's a few that are written from the king of Jerusalem, where the king of Jerusalem writes to Amenhotep III and he says the Habiru. Now, Habiru are like a term that describes sort of the wandering folks, the nomads, the mercenaries, the people that don't have any homeland of their own. The Habiru are plundering all the lands of the king. If no troops come in this very year, then all the lands of the king are lost. That is, the Egyptians, they had laid claim to areas of Canaan, and yet they hadn't been there in a long time because their army hadn't gone out of Egypt ever since the days of Amenhotep II. And now these Habiru are plundering the lands of the king. These Habiru are coming into Canaan, and they are threatening the Canaanite king of Jerusalem. Now, who are these Habiru? I think they sound a bit like the Hebrews. And I'm not saying that it's a direct equivalent, but that these particular Habiru might indeed be the Israelites who are under Joshua. They're coming into the land of Canaan, and they're taking over the land. And sure enough, the lands of the king are going to be lost. Now, the next king that we see, we know him as Akhenaten, but he hasn't got that name at first. He's co-regent with his father. I'm given to understand his father was getting old and his teeth were all rotten and just having a terrible time. But he's originally named Amenhotep IV. Remember, his dad is Amenhotep III. But then after his father dies and he becomes king, he begins to lead in worship, and he begins to worship exclusively the Aten. Now, the Aten is a word for the sun. So he's going to worship the sun god, but he says, we're only going to worship, I'm only going to, and I'm Pharaoh now, so you're going to do it too. We're only going to worship one god, and he becomes a monotheist. And now, when I say they're worshiping the sun, they're using the sun as that representation, but they say, well, no, this God is the invisible God. Where did they get this idea from? I think they got the idea from a generation or two previously, when Moses and the Israelites had been in Egypt, and the plagues had come, and Egypt had been all but destroyed, and the Israelites had left, and now he says, hey, it was good enough for them. Let's try that too. Let's worship just one God, the Aten. And he changes his name to Akhenaten, and he builds a new capital down. It's midway between. It's not down in Lower Egypt. It's not in Thebes, but it's midway between the two. It's a new capital at the place that we know as Amarna, and hence we have those Tel El Amarna tablets that we just talked about. So Amenhotep IV becomes Akhenaten, and notice the way he's pictured. It's sort of very unusual look. I'm not sure if this was just the art. Maybe he just looked like a strange fellow, but he's pictured sometimes with a pot belly, and for a time the Egyptian art becomes very unusual. So there's a revolution not just in religion, but in art as well. But it won't last. Here he is pictured. Remember, I mentioned the pot belly. That's Akhenaten. He and his wife, the beautiful Nefertari. And here they are. They're worshiping, and notice the rays of the sun, symbolizing the Aten, and they rule. But after they die, there's going to be a return back to the old ways. And so his son, originally named Tutankhaten, as soon as dad dies, his son is only 8 years old. Now, and an 8-year-old isn't really going to rule Egypt. Doesn't know what's going on, too young. And so there's a co-regent in place, and there's priests that are there in place, and they say, we're going back to the old religion. Forget the stuff about worshiping only one God. Forget the stuff about the Aten. And so Tutankhaten's name is changed back to Tutankhamen. And so he's a boy king, 8 or 9 years old, and his name is changed now back to Tutankhamen. And we have this return to the old religious system. Now, there's no pharaoh leading the armies, so there's a lack of military strength, and that's been the case ever since Amenhotep II, and that's continuing. But the military's there, and it's been rebuilt. It's there, but it doesn't have anyone to lead them. Now, the claim to fame of Tutankhamun, the reason you know about him, and his name has become sort of a household word, King Tut, as sometimes we shorten it, is because his tomb was found in the Valley of the Kings. And you can go to the Valley of the Kings. You can it's closed off, so you're not always allowed to make entry. But you can go to the tomb of Tutankhamun. And this tomb was discovered. When it was discovered, it was so unusual because it was intact. It hadn't been discovered by grave robbers before. And Howard Carter, he was sort of not a professional archaeologist. He'd been sort of a digger. He'd worked for some other archaeologists, so he knew what he was doing. In 1922, they broke through and they found in the Valley of the Kings this particular tomb, and it had not been opened. As they first opened the door, his benefactor was there, Lord Carveron, and said, "What do you see?" And he said, "Oh, wonderful things." And the tomb was just filled with all sort of beautiful relics, untouched, many of them either gold or wood overlaid with gold. The tomb itself wasn't a large tomb, because when a pharaoh died, if his tomb wasn't ready, there was only 70 days. They had 70 days in which to prepare the body and bury it. And so this was, in a sense, maybe this was sort of a rush job. You go down the corridor, and there's the antechamber, and then a little annex, and then the burial chamber, and then the treasury off to the side. And Tutankhamun's body was there in the sarcophagus. Now, that word sarcophagus, not sure if we've mentioned this before. We get that word from the Greeks. Sarx is the word for body, and the sarcophagus actually means the flesh eaters, because they probably, like opened a sarcophagus and they looked in it, and there's this body that's all sort of decayed, and they thought, oh, this must be eating the flesh off the body. But the sarcophagus, you open it up, and there's one inside of that, one inside of that, but inside is Tutankhamun, and he's still, I understand, he's still in the tomb today. They didn't take his body out, they left it there. It was filled with all sorts of treasures, just sort of packed in there, in order for the young king, and he was only in his late teens when he died, to take with him to the next life. There's jewelry, there's chairs, for him to sit in, very ornate, like I said, wooden overlaid with gold, beautiful workmanship. Notice that some of these are portable, where there's like skids on this tiny little room. Another case, there's a chest that has handles on it and an animal over top. Reminds me a little bit of the Ark of the Covenant. And when you look at these accoutrements, you can't help but think of the furniture in the tabernacle. It's the same culture, the same era from which those things were produced. Now, the tabernacle, that was Hebrews, but they were Hebrews who had been trained in Egypt, and who'd lived in Egypt, and who'd seen all these things in Egypt. There was a tabernacle containing the organs of the king, a place of worship that contained his organs, his liver, his heart, don't remember all, not the brain. They would actually throw the brain away. They didn't know what the brain did. And of course, there's the picture of the king, this exquisite headpiece that shows his likeness, and he's wearing the royal headdress, the headdress of the pharaoh. Now, Tutankhamun dies, and he was just in his teens, so he doesn't have any children. And he had a co-regent, one, a man in authority that was sort of making things happen because he was too young to reign yet. And so his co-regent tries to marry his widow, who was also his half-sister, Akhenaten, the widow of Tutankhamun. And she doesn't really want to go in that direction. In fact, she sends a letter, and we have a copy of the letter. She sends a letter to Suppiluliumus, the king of the Hittites, and she says, "My husband Nibkuria, that's just another name for Tutankhamun, has recently died, and I have no son. But your sons, they say, are many. If you will send me a son of yours, he shall become my husband. And so she sends a letter to the king of the Hittites. Send me one of your sons. Send me one of your sons, and I'll marry him, and he'll be the new sort of viceroy, he won't really be the pharaoh, but we'll sort of make it happen, and he's going to be married to the queen, the first wife of Egypt. That's going to give him authority in Egypt. Now that's unheard of. So unheard of that the king of the Hittites sends a letter back. Are you sure? And he sends some envoys. Yeah, they really mean it. That's really true. And so he sends his son down to Egypt to become the new, the husband of the wife of the queen of Egypt. And he's murdered. He never makes it. He's ambushed and killed, and that's going to make bad blood between the Hittites and the Egyptians. We're going to come back and talk about that next time at a future lecture. But instead now, one of the generals of the previous era, Horemheb, he now becomes the new pharaoh, and he takes the wife of Tutankhamun, the widow, and marries her, and that's the last we ever hear of her. Her name is not in his tomb, is not inscribed in his tomb. Instead, he's going to list himself, not just as the pharaoh, but he will list himself in place of the last several pharaohs. We're not going to mention Akhenaten or Tutankhamun or I. He's going to sort of just erase them, and he will put himself in the king list as having been the pharaoh during all those times. And that tells me again something about Egyptian history. If you don't like it, change it. And that is why we do not read in Egyptian history about Moses or the Exodus event or the plagues. They didn't want to hear about that, so they didn't write about it. They changed the history.